All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. So once again, my name is Kevin Hancock, Director of Solutions here at Exostar. And thanks for joining me today for Ask the Experts, live Q&A on NIST and CMMC self-assessment. Before I dive into the formal presentation, just want to cover a few housekeeping details. So today's session is scheduled to last 45 minutes to an hour, and that does include the question and answer portion. Now, you're going to be muted during today's presentation, but I am going to take questions from kind of two different sources. We did have a number of you submit questions when you registered, so I've got those on a slide at the end of the presentation, and I'll cover those first. Then I'll go over to the chat and answer questions that have come in as well. I also do have another colleague on the line with me. He'll be answering as many chat questions as he can as they come in. But we'll go ahead and answer all the ones that he didn't get to at the end of today's session live. If for some reason we do have an outage, just wait for a minute and try and reconnect. You can either just refresh your page, or you can use that email you received with the link to today's presentation and come back into the presentation that way as well. If at any time you'd like to talk with one of our folks about CMMC or talk to one of our certification assistant experts, or if you really want to talk to us about any Exostar product, you can reach out to us a couple of different ways. You can email us at cmmc-team@exostar.com, or you can come to our website. There's a form on each page that you can fill out and submit your questions that way as well. Let's go ahead and go into the rest of the presentation. So this is the agenda I'm going to cover today. Since I do want to spend quite a bit of time on the question and answer, my live demo of Exostar Certification Assistant will be kind of at a high level. I'll quickly walk through how you can do a self-assessment with that application, how that allows you to manage your overall CMMC program. But then we'll go ahead and do the Q&A, both the questions that were submitted, and then get to your questions that are submitted via chat as well. So first, just a little bit on where we are in the CMMC ruling. So this was a big week, right? On 11/10, the CMMC rule really came into effect. Now, what that means is as of Monday, the Department of Defense can start to insert the CMMC clauses into their contracts. Just as a reminder, the main difference between CMMC and what we've been doing for the past 7 years is that rather than just doing a self-attestation and a self-assessment of how you comply with NIST 800-171, if you're one of those organizations that want to handle controlled unclassified information, you're going to need a third party to come in and assess and determine that you do in fact fulfill those 110 controls. So that's that move to that third party assessment organization that does that. It also did provide some additional clarification about if you're utilizing cloud services as part of your overall CMMC strategy. The requirement that those cloud services must be FedRAMP, and they must be FedRAMP moderate equivalent. Just to level set everybody what we're talking about when we talk about CMMC and these different levels. So CMMC breaks cybersecurity really into the 3 levels that you see here, and the different requirements about what you've got to be in compliance with as well. Now, the majority of organizations out there, right, 63% of the defense industrial base will fall under that level 1. These are organizations that will receive only federal contract information. And you've got to self-assess and self-affirm that you do those 15 requirements. Now, oftentimes there's some confusion around level 1 because you'll often see either 15, you'll also see sometimes 17 requirements. And the reason you see that difference is because if you actually read the FAR clause, it lays out 15 requirements. If you map those 15 requirements to NIST 800-171 controls, there's actually 17 controls that are addressed in those 15 requirements. So that's why you sometimes see that difference in numbers there. But the FAR clause, the Federal Acquisition Regulation clause, calls out 15 requirements. Now, level 2, in order to receive, process, and transmit controlled unclassified information, if that's part of your contract, you have to protect that information in accordance with NIST 800-171 R2. Now, the reason we're explicit about R2 is because there is a revision 3 out there, but the Department of Defense or Department of War specifically calls out R2, not R3. What you need to do is once every 3 years, you need to contract with a certified third-party assessment organization to come out and validate and verify that you have those 110 controls in place. They do that assessment. They validate that you do it. They submit your name and your certification into the EMAS system. You update SPRS accordingly. And SPRS is the Supplier Performance Risk System. Many of you have already used that. That's where you've submitted your self-assessment. The difference here is that now it's also including that third-party assessment. Now, level 2 has these 2 different levels. One only requires a self-assessment. The other level is that third-party assessment. The major difference will obviously be from the contracting officer themselves. They're the ones who will get to determine whether or not, when they let a contract, whether or not it has the requirement for a self-assessment or whether or not it's going to require that certified third-party assessment. And that'll be done by them when the contract is initially put out for bid. So it's not something that you're going to be able to assess really or request. It's going to be determined by the contracting officer. Now, if you're one of those organizations that falls under the level 3 category, you've got some additional controls that you've got to fulfill. You've got those 110 from NIST 800-171, and then you've got an additional 24 from NIST 800-172. You also are required to get a third-party assessment. That third-party assessor is actually DIBCAC itself, and that's the audit agency within DoD itself that is responsible for the defense industrial base. Yearly, you still must do that company affirmation that you're still doing these things. And we're going to talk about POAMs in just a minute, so I'm going to set that aside for just a minute. Now, when starting last Monday, the 10th, right, just a couple of days ago, that really kicked off this CMMC implementation phases. This is directly from the DoD website. So it is expected that this initial phase is going to last for the first year. This initial phase 1, is going to allow that self-assessment for both level 1 and level 2. So this is, if you will, the year to make sure that you have implemented those 110 controls and to start scheduling that assessment with that third party. Because in phase 2, right, November of 2026 is when you're going to be required to have that third party assessment done. Phase 3, after that first 2 years, is when you'll start to see these requirements for level 3. And then obviously phase 4, after those initial 3 years, that's when you'll see a full implementation of the program. Now, please keep in mind, you may see contracts that have brought these requirements forward. So the DoD does reserve the right to implement CMMC requirements in advance of these planned phases for particular contracts. Now, regardless of whether or not you've got those CMMC clauses, right? And the CMMC clause in the DFARS clause section of your contract will be 252.204-7021. That's the CMMC clause. Regardless of if you have that clause in your contract, you probably do have clauses 7012 and 7019 in contracts that you've received before. These clauses require really the same thing, right? These clauses require that you be in compliance with NIST 800-171 and its 110 controls if you're receiving controlled unclassified information, if you're creating it, processing it, transmitting, etc. That's the 7012 clause. The 7019 clause required you to do a self-assessment and score yourself and then enter that score into the SPRS system. There is an assessment guide. That's the NIST 800-171 alpha. That's the A that you see there. That guide provides a scoring system for each of the different controls. Once you calculate your score, we've implemented all these. We haven't implemented these. I've given myself credit and I've taken the negative score for those ones I haven't implemented. I totaled all that up and I enter that score into the supplier performance risk system. This is a system from the DoD and only the DoD has access to it, which uses a number of different metrics to provide that supplier performance risk score. One of the inputs into that overall score is how compliant are you with cybersecurity controls that are in effect. Now, when you're looking at CMMC and controlled unclassified information, the first thing, if you haven't done this before, or if you want to evaluate how you're doing today, the first thing you're going to want to determine is where is controlled unclassified information in my organization. And the way you want to do that is follow that data. So, take a look at your contracts, take a look at how you're receiving that information, where and who in your organization is accessing that information, what systems they're using. Maybe it's paper you received and it's going into a file cabinet. Maybe it's an electronic system where you downloaded a particular bid or proposal. You've worked on a proposal and you submitted that proposal back. All of those things are part of the data flow across your organization. Now, it may also include people like admins, others in your organization. Maybe you have a review process with some leadership involved, etc. All those folks also access the information, they store it, they process it, and then all those systems that they use, right? Are we storing it in a document on my hard drive? Am I working in a CAD system because it's a drawing? Am I moving this data around? So all of those things come into it. So helping you determine the extent and the scope, right? All of this is about the scope of your assessment, because the scope is what's going to determine what that third-party assessment organization is going to take a look at when they see, okay, where have you implemented your controls? Where are they in effect? And what parts of your organization do I have to take a look at? Because when you go into the SPRS system, and when you go into any system, and when you talk to that C3PAO, they're going to ask you, what is the scope of the CUI? Is it your entire organization, or is it what they call an enclave? Have you been able to narrow down a portion of your organization and been able to isolate those systems and those individuals just to a particular area, or if you will, logical area within your organization to store, process, and transmit that CUI. Part of this will also come down typically to a system diagram or a network diagram within your organization. Again, identifying the systems, the tools, etc., where you store, process, and transmit CUI, breaking out those different things to the categories you see here. If I'm storing a document in a file cabinet, or if I'm storing a CUI document on my laptop, those are CUI assets. Those are places where I'm storing, processing, or transmitting CUI. If I've got certain things in place to secure that, a locked door, a video camera system, a firewall, those are all security protection assets. If I've got assets that I'm utilizing a third party for, and that third party is accessing maybe my system, then that might be a contractor risk managed assets. And if that contractor is part of my system, then they typically also need to be CMMC level 2, and they should be able to provide you that justification or verification that they are in fact also a CMMC level 2 organization. There may be things that are they're not necessarily part of the CUI data flow, but you may take information from CUI data and interact with that system. So for example, you're using a CNC machine, a lathe, or something like that, where you're inputting measurements or things like that. Those may be specialized assets. Don't necessarily store or process it, but it has some interaction with you. So you should account for those things just so the assessors know about it and the assessors know that you know about it, and you've kind of understand how it fits into the flow. And then there may be things that are out of scope in your organization. That's, again, determining whether or not this is an organization boundary or an enclave boundary. Now, when we talk about NIST 800-171, we're talking about 14 control categories or families, whatever you want to call them, with 110 individual controls. Now, it also goes a little deeper than that. Within each of those 110 controls, there are individual what-if statements. You know, if they do this, then they should have these things in place. And that's what the assessor is actually going to look at when they come in and do their assessment. They're going to want to know your policies and procedures that you have in place to implement that particular control, and that your control kind of ticks off the list of the things to consider when you're doing that. And again, if you want to see kind of what they're actually looking for, look at the assessment guide. That's what this is, right? This is a page from that assessment guide. This is for control 3.1.3. Control the flow of CUI in accordance with your approved authorizations. So these determine if statements are those, if you will, how have I implemented these things within my policy, my process, and my procedures? So how do I know that you have flow control policies defined, right? So I look at my data flow diagram. How do I know that I've enforced these things? So all of those things are in scope of these different requirements. And the assessor, right, potential assessment methods and objects, that's what the assessor is going to do when they come on site. They're going to examine, right, the policies and procedures you have in place to do these things. They're going to look at the evidence that you've actually done these things, right? So they may look at your configuration, your security configurations about access controls to a particular system that's storing information. They may want to see a screenshot or a baseline configuration that you ensure is always done on all your things. Do you have audit logs of that system, and are you monitoring those logs? Those kinds of things are what they're going to examine and want you to prove that you've done. And then they're actually going to interview your people. This is your policy and procedures. Now, we're going to talk to, say, your sysadmin or the person who grants access to this cloud service that you're utilizing, and make sure that they follow the process that you've documented in order to create that account or give access to that particular user. And then they may test them as part of that as well. So these are the things the assessor is going to do. So it behooves you, when you're doing a self-assessment, to kind of be as hard on yourself as you think an assessor might be. So make sure you've done all these things. Don't just kind of take back and read the objectives and say, yeah, we kind of do that already. Just make sure you've got it documented and you've got the proof that you actually do those things that you say that you do. Now, as we've mentioned, you've got to score yourself on this assessment, and you've got to enter that score into the SPRS system. Now, each of those 110 controls is worth 1, 3, or 5 points. They also are worth -1, -3, or -5 if you haven't implemented that particular control. So that's why your SPRS score will range somewhere between a -203 to 110. Now, I said before, we mentioned this term POAM. That's a plan of action and milestones. Now, and actually one of the questions we got was about, are we allowed to use POAMs? And the answer is yes, you certainly should use POAMs, but the POAMs are should mostly be used for when you're building your overall CMMC assessment program. So when you look at your kind of where am I today, and I go through and I score this, and maybe I'm at a 19, right? That tells me that I'm not really ready for an assessment anytime soon, but I need to put a plan in place to address each of those controls I haven't implemented. That's what POAMs are most, if you will, valuable for. It's you putting in a plan in place to address a shortcoming of your SSP, your system security plan, because you haven't implemented a particular control correctly yet. Now, when we say POAMs are only allowed for 1 point, worth 1 point, and POAMs must be closed within 180 days, that's actually when the assessor is on site. Now, when you say, you're going to say you're ready, you've done your self-assessment, you're at 110, you're going to reach out and schedule that assessor. Now, when that assessor comes on site and they do their assessment, if they find you don't have a particular control in place, if it's one of those 1 point controls and it's one of those allowable 1 point controls, then they're going to say, okay, this is a problem, fix it, and you have 180 days to close that. Reach out to us again within that time frame, and we'll come in, we'll reassess that control and pass you. Now, if you go past that 180 days, you've gone outside that window. So the next time you contact them, you're going to have to contact them to do a complete assessment again. That's what we mean by it must be closed within 180 days, and it's only allowed. But POAMs are best used up front when you're trying to plan out your current assessment, what you need to close before you get to the 110. These are the different controls and their different values, right? So these are all the controls worth 5 points, all the controls worth 3, and all the others are worth 1. This link here, and you'll get this slide deck. Oftentimes, one of the big questions we get is, will I get the slide deck? The answer is yes. So you'll get this, and you can click on this, and this will give you take you to the same information I'm showing here, with the detail around it. Now, these are the 1-point controls that your system can't have open when that assessor comes on site. So, if you don't have a physical access log for your organization, if you're not escorting visitors and have a plan in place to escort those visitors, and probably the visitor logs themselves as proof that you do those things, then you're going to have to open or you're going to be failed, if you will, in that assessment. The assessors won't allow the assessment to continue, and they'll say, hey, reschedule when you're ready. And that may be a sunk cost that you lose because you've already started the engagement. So just make sure you understand when you engage with those assessors, you've got to be pretty confident that you've got that 110 score. This just kind of reiterates what I said before, right? If you do have one of those 1-point ones that can be, you've got 180 days to close that. Now, obviously, this is time consuming if you're doing it by hand. And you really need to treat CMMC like an overall program. It is a program. It's not a one-time assessment. It is something you need to manage and continually monitor. So for this, Exostar has a SaaS application certification assistant, which walks you through that assessment process and allows you to manage that overall CMMC program. When you come into certification assistant, obviously this would be blank, and you start to lay out your particular system and build that system security plan. Part of building out that system is gathering the information both about your organization, what's your name, what's your cage code, what's your address, who are the points of contact for your organization, just keeping that history. And when we generate the SSP, we have that information, including if you want to upload an image. So when you print out the SSP, your logo and everything goes with it. Then you start to define out that system itself. So what is, in Exostar, what are we defining? Is this an enclave or is this an enterprise? Are we using any cloud services like Exostar's managed Microsoft 365? Do I have a picture that I can upload of my network diagram, my system boundary diagram? Because all of this should be inserted into that system security plan. And that is the output of the application itself. So when I go to the documentation library that's created, I'm going to be able to print out that system security plan and provide that to my C3PAO. I'll be able to print out the evidence list of what I've done for each of these different controls as evidence, and I can provide that to that third-party assessment organization as well. Now, the way we're going to go through the assessment process is we need to go into each of these individual controls. These are the practices. And we need to say how we're going about them, right? We need to put in our implementation statements. We need to upload our evidence, and we need to track our progress against that. And what you see here is an organization that's currently got an SPRS score of 19. We've got a number of controls that are in progress. Some we've implemented, some we haven't, and some we've completed. And of those, we're at 19. So what we've also triggered is when we don't have a control in place, we've created a POAM against that particular control, a plan of action and milestones. So we've also got those here. We're tracking that status to close out those POAMs as well. So we know when we're at 110, and we're confident that we can start to engage with that organization. Now, to do that, we're going to go through each of the individual practices. So, if one of these, let's see, I was working on, nope, that's actually not the one I wanted to do, because I've got a procedure and an implementation here for 3.2.3. So we've written up a new policy and procedure, an implementation statement, etc. So we can go into that particular practice. And we go back here. Jump to, that's what I wanted. Sorry about that. Let me go to 3.2.3. Yep. This is going to be insider threat awareness training. Awareness and training in insider threat awareness. As you can see, we haven't implemented this particular control. We didn't create a POAM against it. We should have. That should have been one of our POAMs because we don't have that. But let's go ahead and start to address this. So we're going to put in our implementation statement. This is what we've done. So I've written that out. This is what we do. Around that. And then I'm going to, start to just cut and paste. So this is how we implement it. I won't do the whole thing. I'm going to cut and paste this into my block. I don't want 30 point. That's too much. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that into our implementation statement. For evidence that we've done insider threat awareness and training, I would typically upload the evidence of the log, if you will, of the people who have completed this training for my organization. Now, that may be maintained in an LMS system, a learning management system, and I may link to the output from that. Or it may be a manual attendee list that we keep updated. Or we update a file of a person or something like that. We move this from not implemented to implemented. We mark this, we move this from not started to concluded, right? And then our dashboard would be updated that we've concluded this particular plan, and we should have moved our score of 19. That should have self-calculated. Yep, that was a 1-point value for insider threat awareness. So that moves to 20. And we've improved our SPRS score. I would then, obviously, if I had a POAM against this, I would close out that POAM, say we've done it, to close off that management feature, if you will, or that project management function of this. That evidence that I uploaded would be added to my evidence library. And I would move on, if you will, to that next POAM and that next item that I need to address as part of my overall program. And then when I get to 110, I know I'm ready to engage with that third party. So hopefully that gives everyone a good understanding of how Certification Assistant can help you manage that overall CMMC program. Again, if you'd like to have an individual demo with Exostar, just reach out to us. Happy to have that conversation. This is part of Exostar's CMMC Ready suite, which has 2 companion SaaS applications. One of those is Policy Pro. Policy Pro has templates for each of the different 110 controls, allows you to customize those templates to fit your organization. It then runs those through an AI engine and gives you feedback on those policies. And the feedback is based on what we call a Kenny score, a key elements not included. And it provides you that feedback with those terms, a reference library and things like that. So you can update and improve those policies and implementations to meet the needs of CMMC. Now, you don't have to use the Policy Pro templates if you've already done, compliance requirements for other standards. Maybe there's an ISO standard or something that you used, and you've already written a number of policies for that. You can run those policies as well through the AI engine for a particular control. It'll give you that same score back to determine if you need to customize it to fit CMMC and the NIST 800-171 controls. If you're looking for a secure enclave to store, process, and transmit CUI, Exostar's solution for that is our managed Microsoft 365 solution. If you'd like to see that in action, come to the Exostar website. We have a weekly demonstration of managed Microsoft 365. It's every Thursday at 2 o'clock. It's 30 minutes. One of our team members will go ahead and walk you through how that can help you store, process, and transmit CUI in accordance with 85 of those 110 controls. If you're looking for some help in your overall CMMC assessment, Exostar has a number of third-party partners, including some that are C3PAOs, to really help you wherever you are in your CMMC journey. If you need some assistance in getting a particular control implemented, if you need somebody to come out and do a gap assessment, a mock assessment, kind of really wherever you are in that CMMC journey, but you need some coaching, some services work around that as well. All of these can be bundled together as one solution. We do have obviously that as well with some, with a clear pathway to move you from where you are today to that CMMC compliance. So as I mentioned, we did get some questions in beforehand from people who signed up and filled out the question statement. So I've copied those and put them into the presentation, and I'll cover those first. And then I'll jump over to chat and look at the questions that came in there and try to address those as well. So with CMMC, we have this idea of both FCI, federal contract information, and CUI, controlled unclassified information. CMMC level 1 is if you only receive FCI. So the first question is, how will someone be able to identify FCI in a bid or order? Will it be clearly marked? It should be, just like everything else, but it won't necessarily be marked with the acronym FCI. It'll typically be marked with oh God, I'm sorry, I looked this up right before and now I've forgotten. It basically indicates that this is contractual information about the bid process. It may also be just confidential, marked from your side, because this is what you're providing in response to a particular bid. So it's not marked with the acronym FCI, but it is marked with clear markings that it is about the bid process and the bid response. Now, this again is a subcategory. And if you have a question about something you've received on whether or not it is FCI or not, please ask your contract officer. They'll be the ones that know whether or not something is FCI, CUI, etc. So number 2, based on CMMC level 1 self-assessment and CMMC level 2, how best can a federal contractor differentiate between FCI and CUI since they are both federal contracts? Really, the only way to differentiate between if something is FCI or CUI is the markings in the documentation itself. And as I said, they should be clearly marked whether or not they're FCI or CUI, and it'll come from the people you're working with. So the originating agency, department, or company are the ones that are responsible for marking the information. They've got to, if it's not marked, then you don't have to consider it something. Now, if you receive something and you think this is clearly FCI, you should go back to that originating agency and see if it is. If on the flip side, you've received something that is marked and you don't think it is, you can also go back to the agency and ask them to change the markings because you don't. Now, it's up to them to change it, right? The originator is responsible for marking, but also only the originator can change the markings. Number 3, hopefully I answered this about can we use a POAM or not? So, and the answer is yes, you can. You can use a plan of action and milestone. If if the assessor is the one who identifies that a control is not in place, if it's one of those one-point controls that are allowable, they'll allow you to create a POEM against it, and you have 180 days to close it. Or if you're doing your own self-assessment and you identify something, you should certainly create a plan of action and milestone and address it within that time frame, because that's going to allow you to manage that overall closure of that particular control. So number 4, when do we expect FIPS wording to be removed from requirements? Now, I know the FIPS wording, and for those of you who are not familiar, FIPS is an encryption standard, also a NIST. It's also from the National Institute of Standards. It's FIPS 140-2. I don't really think it's going to be removed from the requirements. I believe it also shows up in Rev 3. So I think it's there as well. I haven't checked in a while, but I don't really see it being removed. Now, there are caveats to that. Occasionally, a library you're using that today is FIPS 140-2 will update itself, and it hasn't, right? You've been pushed a software update. They've changed the algorithm that they use for encryption, or they've updated a current algorithm because of a security problem, and they've also submitted it to NIST to get approved, but it's still in that process. That's okay. That's not, that's understood, if you will, as part of the process. But I don't see the wording actually be removed from a requirement. So number 5, if you submit your CMMC level 1 self-assessment into SPRS, is there still more you need to do? There isn't, as far as SPRS is concerned. You may be asked by one of your contract. So if you're a subcontractor to somebody, because SPRS is only available to the DoD, the people you're subcontracting with may ask you to provide something to them that verifies that you've input that information into SPRS. As far as I know, that's the only thing in addition you need to do. Number 6, can I farm out my certification to a third party to host all required CMMC requirements for a small company? You absolutely can, but you can't farm out. So you can farm out the building of enclave, the management of that enclave, the requirements around that, but you're still going to be responsible for the system security plan and the sign off and affirmation that you do those things. So there are a lot of managed service providers, MSPs, and MSSPs, managed system security providers, that do these things, but you can't farm out the responsibility. It's still going to be tied to your organization. An executive in your organization is still going to have to affirm that you do these things, and it's going to be tied to your cage code. But you absolutely can use third parties to build that for you and kind of get that done. Now, Exostar is one of those providers. We have systems that satisfy, as I mentioned before, managed Microsoft 365 is 85 of those 110 controls, so they can jumpstart you there. But you've still got to create that system security plan. You've got to ensure that you meet those 25 controls that Exostar doesn't maintain, etc. So there isn't necessarily a one-stop shop for everything, unless it's one of those MSPs, but you're still going to have to agree to it. So when you get this, you will also get this slide with useful sources of information. It also does include a link to a free trial of our Policy Pro application. But if you're looking for sources of information, please look here, and it'll help you along that path, and just some self-education tools as well. Now, I got 2 more questions in before I jump into the chat. So it is impossible to implement and comply with all 110 controls at once. Is there a natural, logical, common sense method to order or accomplish this. There is, I think, anyway. For most organizations, since you're going to need to be level 1 as well, I would typically start with the implementation of those 15 requirements or those 17 NIST 800-171 controls. That's kind of the base. Then using the scoring mechanism, right? 1, 3, or 5, the you want to go for the big bang controls, if you will, right? So you want to kind of focus on the 5-point and the 3-point controls. But obviously some of the 1.1s will be the easier to knock off. Because some of those are just around training and visitor logs and things like that. So those are actually fairly easy to implement. So in those cases, you want to be able to, the bang for your buck is making those higher value controls and knocking those down as quickly as possible. But it may take you a couple months to implement a 5-point control, where it may only take you a couple weeks to document and train your people on a few of the 1-point controls. So I'd use that methodology to determine what I should address first and what I shouldn't. But the first thing to do is really to do that self-assessment, see what you've got today, level set the organization, and then build that plan based on that kind of risk assessment of, my value for how long it's going to take me to implement this thing. Okay, so customer wrote in, I use Exostar managed Microsoft 365. Where do I find the inherited information to use when documenting inherited controls? So within Managed Microsoft 365, in the admin section, so if you go to the Exostar tool, the Exostar application embedded within the Teams environment, there's now a documentation tab. If you click in that documentation tab, you'll see the documentation that Exostar has developed, including the SSP around those different controls. And then obviously our shared responsibility matrix as well, which is available on our website. So those two things should get you that information about those particular controls you've inherited. All right, everybody, I'm going to now jump to the chat and see if there's any questions there that haven't yet been answered. So let's see, using the certif assistance, how do you differentiate between NIST and CMMC scores to post into SPRS? So there isn't really a difference between NIST and CMMC. CMMC is the requirement to get that third-party assessment organization to validate that you've implemented NIST 800-171. The score for NIST 800-171 is driven by that assessment guide. So that's the NIST 800-171 alpha. That's the scoring system that you use. And that's built into Certification Assistant. So that's the score within Certification Assistant that you'd see that you actually enter into SPRS. That coincides with your, with CMMC. When you reach 110 and you're confident that you've got that implementation and the evidence to support that, that's when you want to schedule with that C3PA organization. So hopefully that answered that question. Okay, let's see. There's one in here. I asked the 7th question. Wouldn't vetting the people we hired be paramount when it comes to implementing? It is. And when you're looking to vet the organizations that you've hired, one of the places you want to take a look is cyberab.org. They're the ones who would they're the ones who are the certification body for CMMC. So you'd want to vet that they're actually there in the CyberAB marketplace, that they've got the people with the right credentials. You typically also want to ask them about their customers in a similar industry. And you probably also want to ask if they themselves are CMMC level 2. If you are, hiring somebody to build something for you or to manage something for you, their people will will typically be part of your system security plan and the systems they're using to monitor that. And then they themselves should also be a CMMC level 2, so you can inherit that as that portion of your enclave. Hopefully that answered that question. Currently I'm working from home, and how can I document visitor control? You don't necessarily have to document it. You'd probably just have to document that you don't have visitors and that it is a home office. Part of a, documentation is also just, saying, we have you have, if you will, a mitigating control around that. And the thing is that you don't have visitors at your house, and you don't do that thing. I'm hearing conflicting information about the need for MSP to be CMMC certified, which is correct. So a managed service provider whose people are in the flow of processing, transmitting, or storing CUI on as part of their management of your system. If those people are part of it, then they're typically considered, if you will, part of your system security. So that's the time when you typically want them to also be CMMC level 2. If they're not, if they're just providing advice, if they're just providing a method to do something, and then you go out and acquire that and you do that, then in those cases, then they're not part of your system security plan. There's a line item in the 110 controls doesn't apply. So if you don't have a control in place, that's fine, but it's not necessarily not applicable like Wi-Fi. The statement of, if you will, would be implemented because you don't have it in available, not necessarily that it's not applicable. But Wi-Fi is one of those ones that I think is actually not applicable is valid. And some of the other ones, not applicable is not valid. So that's really the difference between those. So COTS products are typically considered FCI, and they don't, and because they're COTS, right, they're in the public domain, and everything about those products are in the public domain. They don't fall under level 2. They're typically only level 1. Let's see. What certification in cybersecurity should my company attempting to get our cybersecurity officer to achieve? So that really depends on your contract. Because that's the DFARS clauses in your contracts or your subcontracts will tell you what level you need to achieve. I'd go back, the best way to say which CMMC level I'm going to need to get to would probably to be look at your current contracts. If your current contracts have the 7019 clause, like that you need to do a CMMC or a NIST 800-171 self-assessment and enter that into the SPRS system, then you're most likely going to be dealing with contracts that require level 2. If you don't have those clauses, then most likely you're only going to be level 1. So that's really the best way I can suggest determining what you might need to get to is look at the contracts you have today. RPO is Registered Practitioner Organization. It's one of the designations of the Cyber AP. Let's see. So So if I'm using a Wi-Fi, what can be the best control to have secure end-to-end communication? So Wi-Fi itself, you want to make sure you've locked down the controller, right? You've got passkeys and all those kinds of things. The end-to-end communication kind of from your laptop to the router and stuff like that, that's kind of controlled by the transmission of the application you're using. So if I'm working on my laptop in Word, right, nothing's leaving my machine, so I don't have to worry about it. If I'm using Word in Teams, I'm using SSL or TLS, and that's an encrypted algorithm. So it's that end-to-end communication is determined by the transport that you're using within that application that you utilize. Like most web applications use TLS. That is a FIPS 140.2 standard. And then if you're using something on your machine, you should encrypt that as well. Let's see. Will DCC high a good control? So I think you might mean Microsoft's GCC high. So Microsoft GCC high itself it can help you achieve NIST 800-171. It's got all the pieces in place to do that, but you've still got to implement all those different Microsoft services and applications that allow you to do that. Let's see. Okay, we're going to do one more and then we got to go. What are the requirements to remote into a physical server? The requirements for a remote server are you typically just want to ensure that the transport is encrypted, right? You want to encrypt data in rest and data in flight. You want to ensure that you're using an actual login to the machine, right, by named users and things like that. So you really need to wrap the 110 controls that are applicable to a physical server to that physical server. So, there's a lot of them in that physical server, like keeping it up to date on its operating system, applications, etc. So, hey everybody, we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody for your time and attention. That's it for today. Hope everyone has a great time and a great rest of the week, and we'll be talking to you soon. Take care.